Chapter 6. Black Hole at Last. They headed around a small planet to find a place to land. And as they looked in front of them, George asks, "Could that be the black hole we were looking for?" Greg says, "Sure looks like it." Ted says, "But it looks different." Pete says, "Well, we are on the other side. Did we even look at this side to see what it looked like?" Ted replies, "You have a point. What are your orders, Captain?" Pete says, "Captain, we are moving pretty fast. Where are we going?" "I guess we need to get turned around and head back through that black hole. Just slow down as much as you can and turn around and head back." They got slowed down and headed back. George said, "We need to stay as slow as possible. Remember how fast we were pulled in from the other side." They slowed down as much as possible, but as they started to get close, they started moving faster. Captain Jim said, "Slow down. We're moving too fast." Pete says, "Sir, we aren't doing it. The black hole's taking over again." As they entered, things started to feel strange. Everyone was grabbing their seats, trying to hold on. Greg moved around the room, hanging on the back of the seats and leaning against the wall. He started back, handing each a bottle of water and a protein bar, saying, "Please drink the water. We are being dehydrated fast. I'll tell you if you need to eat the bar." Everyone was trying to open their bottles and were having a hard time, as they were starting to feel weak. Greg says, "As soon as you drink the water, start eating. Everyone's blood pressure is starting to drop. Does anyone have any sugar packs or candy bars?" He sounded very weak. The ship was slowing down. George asked, "When did we sign up for a Halloween tour?" As they looked around, there were bats, witches, skeletons, jack-o'-lanterns, bats, and black cats, and everything was a sickening green. Captain Jim says, "Speed up as much as you can. We are going to just stop in here." Pete and Al were helping George, trying to get more speed. They finally managed to get out the other side of the black hole. Everyone did a sigh of relief. George said, "Help me slow down." They were starting to feel better and looked around. George asked, "Sir, what do we do now?" Captain Jim replies, "I don't know. We just need to find a place to sit down and get our thoughts together. But try to get someplace where this sick green isn't everywhere. I'm afraid it is going to make me sick if I must look at it much longer." He went to his office and closed the door. Pete looked around and asked, "Okay, who has an idea?" When no one answered, he said, "George, you always have an idea." George said, "Now you want my input. Are you sure? Or are you setting me up for another dressing down by the captain?" Pete said, "Oh, for goodness sake." Greg says, "Just look for a small planet that we can get behind and sit down. It looks like the far side of these planets has clearer air. The bigger the planet, the better." They were finally able to sit down on the backside of a small planet. It had green plants and trees, but the atmosphere wasn't green. Ted asks, "Should we get the captain or just let him rest?" Captain Jim says, "I see you can follow orders very well. I think we need to have a good meal before we make any more plans. I'm starved. Feel like I haven't eaten in days." Greg says, "I know for sure we didn't eat yesterday. Just some snacks and nothing today." All hands in the galley. Everyone got busy and set up a good meal. They all ate heartily and leaned back in their chairs. No one said anything for a few minutes. Finally, Captain Jim says, "I've decided that we should turn on the outside lights, and with the cameras on, We will only need them on a low setting. Then we use the blackout windows in here and all sit or lay back in their chairs and get some rest. Does anyone disagree? Greg says, Great. I will take the first watch. No. We won't need a watch. Everyone needs some rest so we can all think straight. I will go to my office so there is plenty of room in here in case one or more of you want to lay on the floor. Ted says, Captain, that is not exactly according to regulations. Well, what we've been through isn't according to regulations. My orders stand. He went to his office and nearly closed the door, leaving a slight gap. The rest, after following his orders for the night, got the pads off their bunks and tried to find room to lay them out on the floor. Finally, Al took him and put it in his seat and lay back and closed his eyes. Soon there were sounds of sleeping and snores. Al smiled, took out his notebook and started looking at all it had recorded in his inputs. After a while, he smiled deeply and closed it, and leaned back, closed his eyes, and was soon asleep. When he woke up, the others were starting to wake up. He went over, pulled the captain's door closed, and motioned for them to meet him on the second level. He said, I just wanted to talk to you and get your input. When we came out of the black hole, I looked back and it had disappeared. I checked my notebook and it shows that it is not there. Ted says, I noticed that also. Al says, I have an idea. I think it is there only, and it's invisible. Also, I studied that chunk that hit the ship, and I am almost certain it is a part of the black hole. George asked, Why do you think that? I haven't seen anything that would give me that idea. Al says, Remember, I saw the piece up close before storing it in the contamination drawer. Remember, I told you it was black on one side and grayish-green on the other? George replies, I don't remember the grayish part, but I do remember the rest. Everyone was nodding their heads. Al says, Thanks to my notebook recordings, the black on the chunk seems the same as the black hole, and the greenish inside is identical to the green on that chunk. At that point, the captain opened the door and said, Well, isn't this a fine group to be written up for disobeying orders? What have you to say for yourselves? Al says, Don't blame them, Captain. It was all my idea. I've discovered some things and I wanted their input. You were all asleep. Do you want to hear what I discovered? Captain Jim, appearing angry, said, No. I want some coffee and I want to get started on morning duties. George says, But Captain. Al cut him off and motioned him toward the kitchen to start the coffee, and told the rest to put their pads back as he steered the captain back into his office. He closed the door and asked the captain to have a seat. He looks at Captain Jim, trying to decide the best way to start. Finally, he says, Jim, we have been together from the beginning of both our careers, and I think you know I am always on your side and would never disobey your order without good cause. Am I right? Jim says, Al, I trust you, and I know your intentions are good. But showing disregard for my order in front of the others is wrong in so many ways. Yes, but what I need to say now may ruffle your feathers even more. But just think about what I say before you hit me. He smiled. Jim says, I have a feeling I'm not going to like it, but I'll keep an open mind. Al smiled and said, Probably not, but here goes. After we landed on that planet, something came over you. You were constantly disagreeing with everyone and doing a lot of loud speaking to everyone, no matter what they did or said. I know George can be a pain, but it seems you look for ways to disagree with them. Jim says, "You're right, but I can't seem to help it. What is wrong with me? Maybe I should give my position to you or someone else." Al laughs and says, "You want George to take over? He is next in charge." "No," says Jim, laughing. "Do you have another suggestion?" Al says, "Yes. Just calm down and let the rest of us do our jobs. You don't have to do them for us. Take some time to breathe." "Okay, you're right. I will try. Do you think the coffee's ready?" There was a light tap on the door, and Al said, "Yes? What is it?" They heard George say in a small, quiet voice, "Coffee is ready." Captain Jim asked, "How long before breakfast?" George said in a much more normal voice, "It is ready now, sir." Captain Jim says, "We'll be there in a minute, George. Thank you." He looked over at Al and asked, "Was that better?" Al smiled and nodded. "Okay, let's go eat and see if I can stay in a good mood." Al opened the door to the smell of bacon. He just realized how hungry he was. Captain Jim asked, "Can we remove the blackout windows?" They were removed in less than a minute. They could hear the birds chirping. They all sat down and had their silent prayer before diving in. The eggs and bacon were perfect, and there were biscuits and jelly to go with them. Finally, Greg asked, "Al, did you tell Captain Jim what you had discovered?" Just then they heard the rush of many birds taking flight and flying away. Then they heard a loud noise in front of the ship. They jumped and ran to the first level, and there was a big, ugly bird. It was black with fierce-looking claws. He was looking at them, although it should have been impossible for him to see through the one-way glass. It was standing on the nose of the ship and moving closer to the windshield. Captain Jim says, "Hit that emergency horn." George hit it, but it only startled the bird. He hit a few more times, but the bird just came closer and started pecking the glass. Each time, he pecked harder. Captain Jim says, "Hit that big air horn and keep hitting it." That seemed to work as the bird was backing up. George just kept his hand down on the button. The bird finally flew away, but looked back as if to say he would be back. Ted asks, "What was that? I have never seen a bird that ugly. I thought it was going to come right through the glass." Pete says, "It looked like a buzzard, but too ugly for that." Greg says, "I've seen large eagles, but none that big." Captain Jim says, "Whatever it was, it seemed to say he would be back. Maybe he'll bring an army with him. Everyone, stay armed, just in case." George says, "But sir, we aren't allowed to kill things on these planets." Captain Jim says, "You are right, George. If he comes for you, we'll just let him take you." George says, "Captain, that was not what I meant. I just meant we should try to be friends." "Okay, we will try unless he becomes vicious, like breaking our windshield. Then he's a goner. Now, while y'all clean up the breakfast things while I get into my spacesuit, I want to go out and test the oxygen and gravity." Pete says, "The instruments say the oxygen level's good, just a little light, and the gravity is near to Earth's level." "I know. I just want to test it myself." With that, he went into his room and closed the door. Greg says, "You still haven't told him about that chunk that hit the ship?" "No. I have to wait for the right time." He walked out of the room. Pete says, "Now that we've run them out of the room, what do we do now?" Ted says, "We should check all our instruments and all the data this far. I have a feeling that what we decide, or if it becomes necessary, our next move will be fast." Pete says, I agree. This trip has not been according to protocol, and I doubt they will be any time in the near future. George asks, I don't think I'm handling my job very well. Nothing seems to be going as it should. Greg says, the problem isn't you exactly, because you have a feeling for things, and the toll this trip is taking on you makes your feelings near the surface. Just hang in until this trip is over, and things will right themselves. George remarks, You mean, if I survive? Greg laughs and murmurs, I mean, if any of us survive. Everyone chuckled. Captain Jim came out of his office in his spacesuit, helmet in hand. He goes to the door, looks out the small window in the door, and exclaims, Oh no, he's back. Everyone crowded around trying to see. Greg says, Look, he's holding his foot out. Do you think he wants to shake hands? Pete says, I think he's looking for a handout, not a handshake. Captain Jim says, Bring me that biscuit I left on my plate at breakfast. George brought the biscuit and gave it to Captain Jim. He took it and tore it in half. He took the tongs hanging by the door and placed the piece of biscuit in them. Then he slid the window to the side just enough to get the tongs through. He held them out as far as they would reach. He was beginning to think the bird was not going to take it. Finally, the bird cautiously moved out on the branch and took the biscuit. He slowly ate it, not dropping a crumb. Then he reached his foot toward them again. Captain Jim gave him the other piece. The bird ate all of it, but a little slower, still not dropping a crumb. Then he just sat on the branch and looked at the window. George says, I found one more piece. See what he does with it. Captain Jim handed the bird the last piece. He took it and sort of nodded his head and flew away. George says, I wonder what he's going to do with it. Do you think he has babies somewhere? Or is he just going to save it until later? Captain Jim says, I'm going out now. Remember, keep all the locks on until I get back. Al says, he means until we get back. After all, no one goes out alone. Captain Jim looked at him and smiled. He could hear the little birds chirping again and said, While we are out, look through the storerooms to see if we have anything that we can use as bird food. These little guys may also be hungry. Turn the cameras on and keep your radios on in case we need something. Pete gave him a salute. Ted and Greg went to look for bird food, and George and Pete were left to monitor the cameras and the radio.